All right, welcome. Welcome to the second day of being sick and tired. I'm going to do a brief recap of yesterday, and then we will move to our first panel today. So yesterday, we began to talk about health disparities and racial bias. And no matter what language we used, whether we used health inequalities, racism, racial bias, racial discrimination, we all came together focused on the fact that there is a problem within the United States of people being treated unequally. And it affects housing, education, access to jobs, where people live. And that affects health care. And we deem that social determinants of health. We often don't understand that those social determinants of health that we claim are neutral are actually indicative of a history of racial bias in this country that we have not addressed or dealt with the victims of that discrimination. We haven't put them in a better place. This conference, however, focuses on how the healthcare system continues to use racial bias to determine who should have access to quality health care, and whether that is explicit, as we've seen it, and I'll go more into that in a minute, or implicit based on physicians' pro-white bias. And remember, as we discussed and as speakers discussed yesterday, that pro-white bias is held by physicians of every race, of every ethnicity and gender. And so our work here is not done. And even though we had a grassroots movement to enact the Civil Rights Act and to begin the desegregation of hospitals, so we removed the white and the colored only signs, that our failure to continue the fight, to be ever vigilant, has allowed those signs to be replaced, right? We had a discussion by one of the panelists who said that in hospitals, even today, that through patients' requests, that signs of white or no black staff were posted not only on the patient's door, but also at the nursing station. And so let's not go back to whites and colored again. Let's be vigilant, but let's even begin the plan and the action that we need to get rid of implicit bias. Okay? And as we discussed yesterday, panelists focus on the fact that there are mechanisms which have been shown to get rid of our implicit bias. And so I am saying to you that we have to use this as a call to action. I appreciate you coming to the conference. I appreciate you working in your breakout sessions, but we need to do more so that when we leave here, that we will begin the fight to say, right, that everybody should be treated as humans, regardless of how much money you have, regardless of the education you have, regardless of your skin color. For as I tell my students all the time, as you take away my humanity, you are giving up your own. And so we have to understand that we are all humans and we deserve the right to health care and all the things that affect our health. With that, I'm going to turn the podium to Professor Aisha Hardaway, who is in our health law clinic here, and she will introduce the speakers, and then we will move to the panel, followed by our first breakout session for today. Thank you for coming.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's my distinct privilege and honor to be here with you all this morning and to have the opportunity to introduce to you this distinguished panel of guests. I'm not going to read their bios. I'll do a disclaimer now. I'm not going to read their bios in full. They are all very, very well established. established, and so to the extent I cut out anything, I encourage you to read them in the materials that have been provided. First, we have Dr. Gregory Hall. He's the chairman of the Ohio Commission on Minority Health, which was the first freestanding state agency in the nation to develop a concerted approach to addressing health disparities. He's an internal medicine specialist practicing in the Cleveland area for the past 20 years. After graduating from Williams College and the Medical College of Ohio, he completed a residency in internal medicine at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation. Dr. Hall is on teaching faculty at our School of Medicine here at Case and has an appointment as an associate professor. Since 2008, Dr. Hall has served on the Ohio Medicaid's Health Care Advisory Committee, and in 2010, he was appointed a board member on the Cuyahoga County Board of Health. Next, we have Professor Vernellia Randall, who is an emeritus professor of law from the University of Dayton Law School. Beginning at Dayton in 1990, Professor Vernellia writes extensively and speaks on internationally about race, women, and healthcare. She's the recipient of the Ohio Commission on Minority Health Chairman's Award and was named as one of the top 10 most influential African Americans on the 2001 BLACC Equality Opportunity Employment Journalist. Prior to becoming a lawyer, Professor Randall was a nurse who saw firsthand the effects of health disparities for minorities and the poor. While at the School of Law, Professor Randall served as a consultant to the Clinton Administration Advisory Committee on Healthcare Reform and as a grant reviewer for the National Institute of Health. She was also an expert witness in the state of Missouri versus Philip Morris and has been recognized by Who's Who in the World since 1995 and Who's Who in the United States since 1998. Professor Randall retired from the University of Dayton Law School in April of 2013. Next, we have Margaret Montoya, who is the Emerita Professor of Law at the University of New Mexico School of Law. She's the Senior Advisor to the Executive Vice President at the University of New Mexico's Health Sciences Center. I had the privilege of having dinner last night and lots of laughs and giggles with Professor Montoya. She has been a member of the UNM Law faculty since 1992 and has taught courses in constitutional rights, torts, contracts, clinical law, employment law, and in her seminars, she examines the issues of race, ethnicity, gender, culture, and language. She was the interim director for the Southwest Hispanic Research Institute, which was established in 1980. And she's been recognized for by her professional peers and by the Latino community for her work. In 2009, CUNY, which has an acronym that I can't, is it SUNY? No, it's CUNY, right. School of Law named her the Hayward Burns Chair in Civil Rights. She's the recipient of the prestigious Clyde Ferguson Award, given annually by law professors of color for accomplishments in scholarship, teaching, and service. Both the National Latino Students Association and University of New Mexico's Graduate and Professional Students of Color have awarded her Lifetime Achievement Awards. And the New Mexico Hispano Roundtable, a coalition of more than 60 Hispano-Latino organizations, gave her its Walk the Talk Award. I like the name of that. She was named by the Hispanic Business Magazine to its elite Latinas and also received the Kate Stoneman Award for Albany Law School for expanding opportunities for women. Last but not least, we have Professor Jessica Kelly Moore. She is an associate professor here at Case in health disparities and studies the sociology of disability, the sociology of the life, and race and ethnicity. Professor Kelly Moore, I screwed that up, sorry, studies the causes and consequences of health disparities over the life course, particularly those related to race, socioeconomic status, and disability. Previously, Jessica had a grant from the National Institute of Aging to study the relative influence of individual and community-level characteristics on the subsequent health of Black and white older adults over time. In addition, she was co-investigator on the National Institute of Aging intramural study, Health Aging in Neighborhoods of Diversity Across the Lifespan. a 20-year panel study of nearly 4,000 Black and white residents in Baltimore, Maryland. She designed and conducted the ecological levels of the project so that we may better understand how the social characteristics, physical environment, and available resources of a neighborhood influence health and well-being. Welcome to our guests. Welcome to our panel. I know we're in for a treat. I think you each have 15 minutes, and I have signs to remind you.
I appreciate the threat. I will be looking right, and you're sitting appropriately too. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I've seen people that I haven't seen in a while, and I see people I see too often. So it's really going to be nice because I originally thought, law and medicine, those things don't go together. I mean, maybe you guys look for us, but we don't look for you. So I'm happy to see people that are, going to be sort of like-minded. A couple of housekeeping things. I was asked to say a little bit about the Commission on Minority Health, and so I wanted to just spend a couple minutes on that. Back to 1985, or the older people say 1985, when Reagan was president, Margaret Heckler was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and she took note of this startling disparities in health care. She set aside a Secretary's task force on Black and minority health, and they noticed that all the health disparities that were there. A young House representative from Ohio, Ray Miller, who you guys saw yesterday at lunch, was at that conference and came back to Ohio as the story was told, and went and talked to Dick Celeste, who was the governor, and says, we need to do something about this in Ohio. And sure enough, July of 1987, there was the creation of the Ohio Commission on Minority Health. And that was Senator Miller's brainchild, and it was the first, as she said, and you'll probably hear a few more times, but it's worth bragging about. It was the first state commission on minority health in the United States. And there are almost 50 more. There's been bumps and blips lately, so that the numbers dropped. But we actually, as Ohioans, have a lot of history associated with that. And you're going to see a lot of history at these two-day conferences. You've really got a nice lineup, present company accepted. So the Commission on Minority Health, set up by House Bill 171, reports to the General Assembly. It has an 18-member governor-appointed policymaking board, and we fund innovative and creative strategies toward decreasing health disparities. We also look at public health promotion, so whenever we can, the Minority Health Month, which starts Tuesday, actually started yesterday in Columbus, and that's why many of us weren't here yesterday, and Chip wasn't there yesterday. We'll talk about that later. But Minority Health Month starts on Tuesday in April every month, and again, started here in Ohio, and in year 2000, it became a national health month to look at. And we picked a month, or Cheryl probably picked a month with 31 days. Switching over quickly to racial bias. I know you guys have gone over the definition, so I don't need to do it again. But we think of bias as a bias against, but we also have biases for. And so you probably talked about it, but I wasn't here. So an example is pain. We are really seeing a lot of pressure, physicians are, about how much pain medicine we prescribe, and those dirty doctors are giving away too much pain medicine. And so we're really getting, you started by saying screwed, you screwed up, so we're really getting screwed as far as how much pain medicine. We're getting pressure on how much pain medicine we prescribe, and from all around. And so if an African American presents with pain, most people's default will be they're drug seeking. Whether it's abdominal pain, back pain, your default, without thinking, is drug seeking. So if that's your default or that's your bias, the history is not complete. The physical exam is going to be abbreviated. The workup, which is ordering labs and stuff, is going to be poorly thought through. The intervention will usually be inadequate, and the treatment is going to be tainted by all the sort of things that you did. And so what's the solution? And so be aware of your biases. And I'm not going to embarrass anyone by asking if there's anyone in here who does not have biases. So I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. You have them whether you know them or not. If you don't think you have any biases, you've got a little longer way to go than the rest of us. but I'm sorry to tell you, you have them. Okay, now there are types of biases, and I'm sure you covered this: age, belief, race, and ethnicity. When I was putting this together, I was thinking about all the biases. I have a bias against bad smells. So if a patient smells, and I'm in a closed exam room, I'm not good. You know, right. Yeah. And you know, the staff is, oh God, you got one in room 2. Well, no. And so what did you do? Well, we sprayed, but you don't want to spray in front of someone like they, like they smell. But I know I have the bias. I recognize it. My staff knows I have that bias, and so we have to do it. I was driving over here thinking about biases, for the majority. But if Obama came to my practice, he would not wait in the waiting room. He'd go right to the exam room. I wouldn't finish what I was doing with the last patient. He'd get extra labs. So, I have bias. I would have a bias toward him. I don't know, or George Bush, anyone. It's the honor of it. So we all have a social status bias. That's more of an example of that. Marriage status. My mother would say, "So-and-so's never married." Oh. Never married? So she had a bias against someone, 40 or over who was never married. All right, so the biases were organized. Harvard orthopedic surgeon Augustus White, he wrote Seeing Patients, Unconscious Bias in Healthcare. Did anyone mention this yesterday? Yeah, well, it's a physician, know thyself. Otherwise, doctors' largely subconscious discrimination against a wide variety of patients will continue. And unfortunately, if I was speaking to an entire group of physicians and said, who doesn't have biases, there would be some people that raised their hand. They would. And I probably still would resist doing it because I don't want to know who they are. And then I would have a bias against them. Right? Right. Okay, so when I read about Dr. White, I wanted to say Dr. Whitaker. I read about Dr. White. I was led to this site, Implicit at Harvard. You guys, who's heard of this Project Impact? A lot of you guys have. And unfortunately, I took the test, and that's all I'm going to say about it. But it measures your biases. So be aware of your biases, work to counter the effect of your bias, implement population-specific protocols that will allow a more unbiased approach. And so this is my bias. I mean, everyone may not agree with protocols. There are physicians that don't agree with protocols, and there are patients that don't want to agree with protocols. Physicians say, let me do this. Let me make decisions. Let me evaluate that. Following a protocol takes the intelligence out of diagnosing. But I believe the protocols, by and large, help, and have a diverse workforce so the biases cancel. Since we all have these biases, you run across someone who may have no bias against bad smells. My wife can walk into any smell. I had trouble changing my kids' diapers, but smells don't bother her. She's a nurse. Smells don't bother her. Other things bother her, but not smells. So if you have a diverse workforce, you can have those biases cancel. So the benefits of a diverse workforce, rich population of biases, keeping up with the changing patient base, better innovation and productivity because you've got more inclusion, and better research. I mean, when you have a better population, you actually include them in the research. Initially, maybe 20 years ago, people always thought, well, if we include African Americans, then the study's not pure. On hypertension, their hypertension's harder. So if we include them, we're trying to prove this works. If we include a diverse background, we'd have to have so many, a critical number, in order for the data to be worth something. So they use that sort of rationale to exclude some people in order to make the data better. But when you have a rich population of diversity in your patients and in your workforce, you can improve that medical research. And advancing cultural competence. You guys, I know you've gone through the definition of cultural competence. This is the one I like. Knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors required of a practitioner to provide optimal healthcare services to persons from a wide range of cultural and ethnic backgrounds. And so another problem with cultural competence is it implies that you've reached someplace. Yeah. I am now culturally competent, and I can go home. And it's not true. Culture, by definition, changes over time. It evolves, and so you're always chasing cultural competence, over time. So Thank you. And so you want to empower, that went by fast, too. That's all right, but I got you. Empower patients to increase their own health literacy and mention bias when they see it. So this is an example of a chest pain protocol if someone came in with it. So we have a Latino male with chest pain. What would the population data suggest as a priority? And this I am going to go over. Prevalence of coronary heart disease in a Latino. Just look, this is me, African American male. This is Latino. Who knew that Latinos had twice the incidence of coronary heart disease than African American men? Who knew that? Raise your hand real quick. I only got 3.5 minutes. I didn't know it either. High cholesterol, okay? Then again, men, right there, 14 African American men there. So the incidence of high cholesterol is double in Latino. Incidence of a low HDL, which is a separate risk factor. Point to it again, African American male and us. And then cholesterol screening, just the ultimate insult. And again, there's the Latino. They're screened less than African American male. So I mean, when I thought, well, African males, we get everything bad, they're Latino males suffering worse at the same time. So health disparities impacts everyone's health. Ohio has done poorly. I'll summarize, my time is running out. 42nd overall, 49th in infant mortality, probably going to 50th in the state. So you'll be hearing a lot about that in preventing obesity and whatnot. Very poor, but we spend more than 37 other states. We spend a ton of money to get poor outcomes. So how do we eliminate disparities? Bias awareness, improve cultural and linguistic competency, improve diversity of the health-related workforce, improve data availability. So when we get data like we talked about with the Latinos, now when you see a Latino male with chest pain or abdominal pain or back pain, you should be thinking, he's at a real increased risk for heart disease. And physicians don't know this any more than you guys knew it. So improving the data availability and realizing that health disparities impact everyone. I mean, I gave a talk that talked about the national report that improved, it talks about the health disparities across the nation. And everyone's health improved, but the disparity didn't change. And so as we do things to impact health disparities, everyone's health improves, it's just the difference didn't change. And so when people work against, what are we spending all this time on health disparities, you're impacting them. And I like that quote about the humanity. I'll probably steal that when you're not around. So, thank you. And minutes under.
Buenos días. Buenos días. Gracias por invitarme a esta conferencia. Thank you so much to the organizers. I thought yesterday was an extraordinary day. I want to begin by connecting some dots. And I want to begin with something that Camara Jones said yesterday. Dr. Jones talked about historical injustices. And so I want to talk a little bit about how Latinas end up being white. And to do that, we really need to go to the 1840s when the United States invades Mexico. And Mexico ends up losing almost half of all of its land mass. And in doing that war ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the treaty cedes land that will become all or part of 10 states in the West. And there are also 115,000 people, mostly in New Mexico territory. So my family comes from those families, and what happens is that at the time, immigration law allows only people who are white or African descendants to become U.S. citizens. So the question goes to the Supreme Court, how are Mexicans, so the United States doesn't want the people. the land. But the deal that Mexico has struck is that they have to take the people. But the problem that is presented to the Supreme Court is, well, are Mexicans white? And so the Supreme Court writes an opinion that says they are not anthropologically or scientifically white, but they will be allowed to come in as citizens. And therefore, we talk about being off-white, right? That what happens is we are given legal status as white, but we never enjoy the social status of whiteness. And I could go on and talk more about the string of cases into Hernandez versus Texas, which is decided the same day as Brown versus the board, that gives equal protection to Mexican Americans because of Jim Crow-like segregation. But I don't have time to do that. So what I do want to do is very quickly go through and tell you about a class that I'm teaching, because I think that the class picks up some scholarship, but also some new strategies for addressing racial bias. But before I do that, let me just mention the work of Scott Page, who was a mathematical economist at Michigan. Scott Page is known for something called cognitive diversity. He argues that diversity trumps ability. I think that there are very few opportunities for us to actually experience that. I experienced it yesterday. When we see the different toolboxes that the different professions have, when we see how robust the discussion can be, we begin getting a glimpse of what he's talking about when he's talking about cognitive diversity. He's got a YouTube video called Beyond the Numbers. I definitely suggest that you take a look at that. So what I have been doing with the class I'm teaching is creating a law-med partnership for undocumented immigrants. And so one more thing about how I see myself in the academy. And for this, I borrow from my colleague, Christine Zuni Cruz, who's a Pueblo woman. She lives on the Isla de Pueblo. And she talks about the two of us as having been given the keys to the academic storehouse. So if you think about law schools or medical schools, they are, compared to our communities, resource rich. We have access to printing, we have access to a lot of technology, but mostly I have access to brain power. I can use student labor to address the problems in the community. And that's what I seek to do. I seek to open the back door of the academic storehouse and push out some of the resources. And that's what this class that I'm teaching, which is called Law, Health, and Poverty, is an attempt to push some of those resources out and to address the problems of undocumented immigrants. So I see immigration as a social determinant, particularly today. And if we had more time, and I think that the only way to address it is with upstreaming, which is now this idea that is used that you really have to go to the causes rather than to the symptoms. And I think that lawyers working with doctors or legal professionals working with health professionals are really the only way that we're actually going to get some traction on this. Words matter. When we talk about illegals in this society, we are talking about something that is, first of all, jurisprudentially incorrect. Most people who are here without authority, without documents, have only committed a minor civil violation. Most people don't know that. Most people think that if you have crossed the border and are here without documents, whether you've overstayed your visa or otherwise arrived here, that you are a felon. Many people think this is a very serious violation. In fact, it is not. about financiers, you know, the Wall Street guys who stole trillions, as illegals. I mean, they haven't been adjudicated, but certainly their behavior is as criminal as the people, but we call them illegals because it's the kind of racial stereotyping that we've been talking about. So if I had the time, I would go through and tell you about the numbers, just what the scope of the problem is. We're talking about some 5.5 million children who have parents who are unauthorized. So under the law today, undocumented immigrants are not allowed to be insured even if they can pay for the insurance with their own money. And that is true under the Affordable Care Act. There is a way of getting emergency Medicaid, and that's an important sort of cavity within this law that prohibits health care for the undocumented. 70% of New Mexico births last year were funded by emergency Medicaid. Now, not all of those are undocumented. Many are low-income women who don't have any prenatal care. So what a LawMed partnership is, this is a device that basically started about 2004. There are many law schools and some medical schools that now have this coalition, and it's highly structured. I mean, there are MOUs, memorandum of understanding, with the law schools, with the medical schools. So it's a whole architecture of arrangements in order typically to provide services to low-income people. So what you do is you usually have a referral either from the doctor to the legal office or from the legal office to the medical office. They are working very successfully. There are very few, a handful, that are looking at the problem of undocumented immigrants, which is what we're trying to do. So the class that I'm teaching is taught with the executive, myself and the executive director of the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. She comes in with all of the contacts and all of the knowledge, the specific knowledge about immigration law that we need. It's an interdisciplinary class. If I had time, I'd tell you more about it. So the class is multimodal. And so one of the things that we're doing is directly challenging the stereotypes BLACC. I don't know if you know the song. It's Wake Me Up. I suggest you watch the video. It's very effective at telling a story about day laborers. Both the family that is caught crossing the border with the child, the man who is in the United States. The argument that we make in favor of providing health care is both just on a moral basis, right? But the other is that it's economically sound to do so. And there are strong public health rationales for doing so. But there is no question that overwhelmingly the people who are here contribute to our society. They do work that, for the most part, will not be done by other segments of our society. This is a tool that we use. We mind map a lot. This is a mind map of the federal health insurance programs. This is a photo of a class. In the front of the class are 2 medical doctors and 6 medical students. We also had a class, Thinking Like Lawyers, in which we had lawyers and law students present to the class. These are the research projects that the students are doing in order to actually create the LawMed partnership. But this is really where I want to go, because the point that I want to leave you with is that if we are talking about interpersonal, institutional, and systemic bias, the approach that we have to take is a race-conscious one. We need to have race-conscious theory and policies and practices and tools. So if we look at medical education, the LCME has now required since 2000 that law students be exposed to cultural and linguistic competency. But you'll see that the rule talks about culture rather than race. But if we look at legal education, there is no requirement, right? There is no discussion about requiring cultural or linguistic training. And if you look at some of the materials that have been produced, you will see that there is an elision. There is a sliding across race and racism. If you look at the literature, there are very few references to new race scholarship. And I could give you more information about that. Another tool that we need is theory. So in order to understand identity, one of the tools that critical race theory uses is something called intersectionality. At its lowest level, intersectionality says, I am in every moment both gendered and race. I can't separate those, right? And, you know, if I talk about myself as Mexicana, I mean, I am talking about that as a racial category, but it's gendered, it's ancestry, language, class, accent, immigration status, many other things. But we also have to understand that intersectionality is really talking about intersecting systems of oppression. And that one of those systems, racism, is in conversation with others. And so in order to be a better racist, you look at homophobia. In order to be a better racist, you look at patriarchy. And these are constantly morphing and getting better and better at what they are trying to do, which is exclude. So conflation is another idea out of critical race theory. And conflation is so that if I'm talking about culture and cultural competence, is that really about race? Well, race really merges with, and because it's so hard to talk about, it disappears into all of these other discourses. And the only way that you're going to talk about race is to talk about race, even though all of these other things do the work of race. I propose that, in fact, we need to have a dramatic reframing of race. We need to reject colorblindness as an analytical, ideological, or policy stance or objective. We need to use race theory and practices positively. We can cultivate the identities of our students. 10 years ago, I would have said it's not my business. Today, I actively try and bring my students to understand that they can be racialized, and it's something that can be a positive addition to their mental toolbox. We can subvert stereotypes. We can locate power and power imbalances. We can talk back to power, and one of the most effective ways is using narrative. And when we do, we expose subordination, because it is the details of stories that show how power plays out. But this is one of the ideas that I want to leave with you. We want to promote dissensus, that we don't agree, and that we need to bring forth those places of disagreement. We need to bring out voices of dissent. There are race-conscious tools out there that we need to know about. California has produced a racial report card. You need to look at it. Just Google it. For the past 4 years, the New Mexico legislature has introduced a memorial on racial equity and institutional racism. One of the authors, I'm happy to provide that to you. There are racial impact statements that draw on environmental impact statements. They are very useful to show how race affects policy. There's state and local legislation. For example, California is proposing insurance programs for undocumented immigrants using state monies. My own county, Vernellia County, just on Tuesday, decided that they were going to reopen the negotiation of the lease with the university hospital. The hospital gets $80 to $90 million a year for uncompensated care. This year, the county commission said, you're not getting it without accountability metrics. And those accountability metrics are partly about the undocumented. This is my takeaway. I fundamentally disagree with Chief Justice Roberts. About everything. But he does not know what he's talking about when he says that the only way that we can stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. That is sheer nonsense. The only way that we can address the sickness and tiredness is by race talk. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Good morning. It's a little hard to follow that, so bear with me. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I am neither law nor medicine. I'm a sociologist, so give me a little extra, room, a little rope there too. But one of the things that I've really enjoyed about yesterday and today is really sort of the open discussion and the sort of the interdisciplinary sort of thinking about questions about implicit bias, racism, structural issues and where things are. And so I think one of the things that I wanted to do was be a little playful and think about sort of what sociologists have been thinking about some of these issues and how this might sort of contribute to the conversation in a way that we thought about. And so I decided to do it around this idea of sort of symbolic prejudice. And this really sort of in some ways really sort of pulls us out of this idea of our own implicit bias and our own sort of motivations, even our own sort of backgrounds, and more sort of at a cultural conversation level. Like, where are we at as a society, and how are we sort of regulating that conversation? So when we think about sort of symbolic prejudice itself, we think about things as groups as sort of being considered inferior because they violate sort of prevailing symbolic values of society, right? We're good Americans, we're independent, we're self-sufficient, we work hard, we show self-restraint, right? We earn things, these things are part of our American sort of values, and they're a part of our sort of core and how they write into much of our culture and how we think about things. So groups that don't, or people who don't sort of support those and almost seem to violate these symbolic values of our society sort of make us a little nervous because we think, maybe you aren't quite as American as the rest of us in what we sort of think about what we're doing. And there's been a lot of really good work over the last decade in particular sort of around this idea of symbolic racism specifically. And this is considered among sociologists to be sort of the new modern racism. It's not cool to be sort of explicitly racist, right? But we can do it in a symbolic kind of way where we can sort of talk about it in coded value language without ever having to explicitly name a group or even have to explicitly come out and say what it is we really sort of mean. And so, sorry, my numbers ended up a little odd there, but Sears and Henry, they've done a tremendous amount of work. You can actually sort of put them in Google Scholar. There's a lot of work there. But they came up with sort of 4 specific statements, and they've tested a number of these things. And these statements are sort of part of this idea, so that Black Americans no longer face prejudice or discrimination, right? And that the failure of Black Americans is, to make progress results from their unwillingness to work hard enough. Black Americans are demanding way too much too fast. We'll get there, calm down, we'll get you there, what kind of thing, right? And the Black Americans have really gotten more than they deserve, right? So you can sort of see how these sort of, these things are very sort of, invidious and how they can sort of get in a way, but don't come out and explicitly say, how we sort of think about them. There's a really nice book, 2010, that came out called Us versus Them, about ethnocentrism. And it's something I want to sort of point out, so it's an excellent read. But one of the things about it is really sort of this idea of what drives sort of public sentiment, public support of policy. And we find that white voters, and the Republican Party is 80% white, so we have some conservative sort of pieces that throw in here as well. But white voters in particular tend to support policies and programs that represent entitlements or equal opportunity. Everybody benefits, right? Everybody gets something out of this. You know, Social Security, I worked hard, I get my money on the other end, all these ways in which we sort of support these. But we find that white voters in particular oppose things where it seems like there might be a differential benefit for minority groups, or a group, you know, that's that ethnocentrism, right? That some group's getting something more than my group is getting out of what they're doing. Or, heaven forbid, something that looks like redistributive justice. We may not even get started on that one. That's a non-starter in many ways. But again, it's this idea of splitting out equal opportunity versus equal outcomes, and where we think about this. And health equity was tossed around a fair amount yesterday. So I'll go quickly over this because I want to get to some meaty stuff. But again, as part of sort of the way they were thinking, is they summed it up in saying that we find public support generally in the US around this idea that there's an equal benefit or some kind of equivalent risk or liability for everybody, right? There's broad support for you know, funded childhood immunizations. Everybody's a baby at some point, everybody wins. You know, we like that kind of thing, right? You know, it's sort of sexy. You know, but we also like things where the solutions are grounded in organizational or structural levels. I don't have to change something about myself, but it gets fixed at some other level. And then we all sort of benefit, and it sort of raises all boats. So we like those. And of course, with that, the no group receives any more resources than anybody else. So that gets back to that equal opportunity sort of idea. So just quickly, a lot of this work has actually been done around food stamps, and this came up a lot last year around sort of the US Farm Bill debate, and the symbolic racism and the symbolic prejudice that sort of played out in whether or not we were going to support the expansion of SNAP or even just, you know, sort of close the whole program altogether. And we found that 40% of Americans supported reducing SNAP, and that only 24% actually supported the expansion, so less than a quarter actually sort of supported that. Just to give you some sense, in case you don't know, average benefit is $133 a month for 47 million Americans. But 73% of them supported stricter worker-seeking work things, right? We need you to work a little harder for this free money we're handing out. And then 68% of Americans supported this idea of the restrictions on eligible purchases. Well, I'll give you the money, but I'm going to tell you how to spend it, right? You know, I don't want you buying steak. You can have the ground beef at the 80-20. You know, so we work really hard, you know, to make sure that that you're using it the way we think you need to do it. And much of this language wraps itself around these American values, right? We see people receiving something for free as violating this sort of American value, these symbolic values. We call it deservedness, right? You didn't really earn this, right? You're not working hard for it. Self-control. Well, if you budgeted your money better, it would go further. Right? Hard work. If you just went out and got a job, this wouldn't be a problem. So you can sort of see how this sort of wraps itself into the conversation, the national conversation, in a way that I never have to say race, right? I never have to say it. I'm talking about earning things and working and being a part of something that's sort of to do that. And that sounds good. That feels better to us. The problem is that when we think about the face of the SNAP recipient, right, this gets into it. So we don't even have to say it. We don't have to flash her face up. We see the unmarried woman in the inner city with her children. That's the SNAP recipient, right? It's not the 72-year-old widow in Iowa that we think about, although she's getting money too. But it's how we think about who that face is, and that's why we can say things without ever having to say race. So to turn sort of quickly to sort of my new beef, the Centers for Disease Control have what they, have sort of trotted out this sort of great program called Winnable Battles. You can Google it, it's right there. I have it down here at the bottom, /Winnable Battles. And it's 10 targeted areas for where we think we can sort of move the needle in public health. In the next, sort of associated with sort of the Healthy People 2020 idea, like where can we see measurable change? Where can we sort of get some wins, right? Get some wins under our belt, do these sorts of things, and that's great. And there are 10 areas that they've targeted. food safety, global immunization, healthcare-associated infections, HIV in the US, the lymphatic filariasis is, I'll talk about that in a second, motor vehicle injuries, nutrition, physical activity and obesity, mother-to-child transfer of HIV and syphilis globally, teen pregnancy, and tobacco. Now, just for the sake of today, we're going to take global immunization, the two globals, off the table because they're sort of their own agenda, and there's some other things that are sort of going with that. But among the 8 that remain, we find that 5 of those 8 represent equal opportunities for health, right? Nobody wants an infection when they go in for surgery, right? That's an equal opportunity, right? Nobody wants to get sick from the chicken they bought at Giant Eagle, right? So that's an equal opportunity. These are things that everybody wins from, right? And the, I was mentioning the parasitic infection. You can't help getting stung by a mosquito, right? That has an infection. So if we just have more drugs out there and better screening opportunity, everybody wins, right? So you have 5 of these battles that are about equal opportunity. And what we find when you look and you see their targeted areas of intervention and what they consider to be the action steps, the CDC, you find that the solutions, much like the policy we found in the Us versus Them book and how people support things, that the solutions are embedded in these structural and organizational domains. Food safety is not about what you do with the chicken when you get home. It's about how it got processed, how it got inspected, how it got stored, right? That's at an organizational structural level, right? You're a victim, had nothing to do with you. Oh, and the motor vehicles also has to do with working with the car companies to improve standards. There's only like 2 small items around distracted driving and a couple other things, but it's mostly around improving cars. And we find that the health, as I said, opportunities are equal. And we find here that no group receives more than anyone else, right? So these feel great. We can work with these, right? And we do. But this leaves us with 3. Tobacco is sort of an interesting, the reason I have tobacco on this list is because its primary areas is actually around sort of workplace, healthcare areas, smoking bans in organizations and buildings. That's actually their targeted area. So it's less about cessation programs and more about structural. So that's why it got moved over here. But this leaves us with 3 sort of sticky ones, right? Nutrition, physical activity, and obesity. I would like to see the needle move on that too, public health-wise, right? HIV prevention and teen pregnancy. When you look and you see what these targeted interventions look like and where we think we're going to do things, we find that these are predominantly grounded in individual health behaviors, choices, and your own personal self-advocacy, right? So we've now switched over out of structural into individual things. Not surprisingly, we find that these are disproportionately problems among race and ethnic minorities. We have the non-Hispanic blacks at an obesity prevalence of nearly 50%. With the pregnancy rates over here, I borrowed these numbers. Actually, I have literally the people who wrote the book on the subject, which I'm going to come back to. But sort of this idea, you see these sort of rates, the pregnancy rates, and you have to see the HIV incidence, which is a number I hadn't seen recently, and that sort of frightened me a little bit, that Black Americans account for 44% of all new HIV cases, despite being only 12% of the population. That's a frightening number. But you can sort of see that these groups are disproportionately affected by these outcomes, right? Oh, there it is. But don't worry, we have resources. The CDC has made us videos on how to fix this stuff. And they have videos for all of these areas. And so I'm going to beat up the one that I know best, which is around sort of physical activity and nutrition. And I went through and I watched their video. I was very excited. I thought, boy, that's all it took. And interestingly, I started listening. It was only about a 4-minute and 10-second video, and the word individuals was used 25 times. The word communities was used once. And so imagine, so here's just a couple things. Weight loss is a decision only individuals can make. The types of decisions we hope individuals make are, you can sort of see this, right? So we have this sort of silky smooth voiceover guy saying, now stick with me here for just a second, okay? And he's saying we must invest in changes in our communities as well as changes in our behaviors, okay? Meanwhile, these screenshots, as he's saying this, are all individual choice, all love it. I love the middle, they interview them really briefly, like the middle class white family who all go out in the backyard and play basketball in their own backyard. It's all lovely, right? So, but again, this, but you sort of see this sort of happening. So the one time they say the word communities in this entire video, it's then overlaid with all of these individual choice making among sort of white middle class people. So it's sort of this sort of interesting sort of flip here. So P.S., communities matter. We are ignoring much of what's sort of happening here because these things start to smell a little bit like redistributive justice, right? It starts to smell a little bit like we might have to give more to some groups than others to get everybody up to par and get that sort of health equity piece that we're sort of looking for. Access and availability. Don't even have time to get into all those things. Environmental justice is really sort of major area. Do you even have a safe place to recreate? Goodness gracious, we can't say get out and take a walk. It just doesn't work that way. There was a program in Cleveland that was training children to help to run in the marathon. The only safe place for them to practice was in the hallways of their school. Community health care interface in terms of what we're doing. Policy influences around the US Farm Bill. And one of the things we have to keep in mind is we subsidize wheat, corn, soybeans to make over processed food, which is only making us fatter, and then we give you a very small food benefit where the only thing you can afford is this over processed food. Yeah. So in many ways, thank you very much, we just gave our own self the problem. So, but we don't think about these, right? And of course, I like the education priorities where we have to take gym out completely from school because we have to spend more time on reading and math, or otherwise your school's going to be downgraded and then we're going to be in trouble and people are going to take it over. So you're in these horrible sort of situations. But none of that matters as long as we balance our calories and go out and play in the backyard with our families and do these things. So I beat up them, but I just want to say that the framing of the other battles is very similar. The HIV prevention, actually, I have a doctoral student who's working on this right now and has documented that much of what we do is around this sort of risk group, stalking kind of idea, being a good advocate for yourself and asking your partner to wear a condom, and this is going to prevent, HIV infection, where we're going. And my colleagues Tim Black and Mary Erdmans, who've kindly come today, literally wrote the book on this sort of on this issue around teen pregnancy, the same framing of the problem. And one of the phrases I borrowed from them that they've cited, which is referring to race ethnic minorities as having third world fertility rates. Nice language, right? Yeah, there you go. So I'll end it with sort of this idea, where does the symbolic prejudice sort of come from? Where are we sort of going with this? And why am I sort of focused on this? And part of it's because it removes this obligation to invest in groups differentially, right? You violate the American culture of hard work, self-restraint, doing all these things, so therefore you don't do that. It allows for these failures when you don't lose the weight and you get diabetes and you do all of these things, right? You get HIV, to be framed as at an individual victim blaming level, takes away all responsibility from society, and it permits what we call sort of this aggregation fallacy, and this idea that if lots of people in this group make lots of bad choices, that may be because they all do that, or it might be a cultural issue, a cultural dysfunction. So maybe we can just blame the group generally. And my time's up, but I just want to sort of finish with we were supposed to be the solutions group, so I want to leave you on a good note. And really this idea of recognizing extra individual factors in our cultural conversations, how we have conversation, how we look at language, and being good police persons of the language that we are using. And really sort of, I want to point out as we sort of ended, we have to stop thinking about health as a limited good. There's enough health for everybody out there. And it's this idea that we have to stop thinking of it as, you get enough, it's going to take from me. We can all be healthy, right? So the idea is, if we want to think about health equity and equal outcomes, we need to think about sort of where that money sort of goes and how we sort of think about the priorities, because there is enough health for everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, I'm going to slowly get over here. Last night, how do I, remind me how I move things? Arrow, okay. I thought about wanting to reframe this discussion, sort of like, in retitling it actually, the new American apartheid, getting rid of equalizing health care won't get rid of the new American apartheid. And my discussion actually flows through this. I'm going to talk stories, I'm going to give some numbers, and I'm going to frame it. And I'm feeling very emotional, largely because I'm a direct benefited. All my criticism of Title VI comes from a person who directly benefited from it. I was 16 years old when Title VI was passed. And my whole family history changed because of it. My father, who graduated from Jarvis Christian College in 1949, the year after I was born, who never held a white job until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and except for the Civil Rights Act for 1964, would have never had a white job. That's what we called them. There were jobs to be had, but the jobs, my dad drove taxi, college educated. And I hate it when I hear people say, black people don't appreciate education. I said, shit, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. Black people were getting education when they knew that there was nothing they could do with it. Both my parents graduated from a college knowing, living in the South, that they had very little choices that they were going to be able to make with that degree. But my family nevertheless went to school, and that is true today. The kids have not changed. They go to school, they get an education knowing that as compared to white people in this society, they will not have the same opportunities. But they do it anyway. So don't criticize the young people for what they're doing in education. I want to talk about the legal system as a structure for change in health, because there's only two ways we change this society: money and law. If you don't have the money, you better have the law, because otherwise you're spitting in the wind. You're in your efforts. Everything in this society functions under the law. The law authorizes limits and authorizes behavior. We have racial inequalities because the law says that that is an acceptable thing. You can work on changing values all you want, but until the law says that's unacceptable, you are working against. People will, we like to say that we are a nation who believes in solving disputes by the law. So when the law is quiet on something, you must realize that the law is authorizing it. When the law is quiet on something, the law is authorizing it. That's the only way you can look at it. You can't say, well, and you have to look at, well, how long has it been authorizing it? Why hasn't it changed? There is a reason the law functions the way it does. And I'm going to go past that because I don't have time. I just want to make sure that everybody understands that when I talk about the law, I'm not talking about just statutes and cases. I'm also talking about regulations, because they have the force of law. And obviously state and federal constitutions. It is my belief that anti-discrimination law today is institutional discrimination. Title VI, which I benefited from. I was the first and the only black in every job I had in my lifetime. You do not understand the stress of being in a historically white institution all your life. But I am thankful to Title VI for that opportunity. But Title VI no longer can solve the problems we have. And until we admit that, we will continue to have inequities in our society. And this is when I talk, I'm not going to get into this, but this is a framework that you can think about in terms of how historical and current deprivations and oppression leads to embedded racial inequality, then leads to communities having no choice. Dayton, Ohio has 75,000 people within the city limits and one grocery store. One grocery store. But they have every fast food chain you can think of. Every fast food chain you can think of. But they can't put grocery stores. Of course, Dollar General's taken over that space. So you can get all the processed foods you want on every corner because Dollar General is serving cheap processed food which is within a half a mile of in Dayton. You can, within a half a mile of wherever you are in that city, there's a Dollar General. But Dollar General doesn't have fresh foods. Dollar General doesn't have fresh meats. Dollar General just has processed foods. What did I do? Okay, I'm going to get control of my emotions. Not. Most racial inequalities is due to institutional discrimination. So when we talk, that's the only way I can look at that. And the law, this is an example. I said, we were talking last night, we were talking about income and tax, and I love tax law. I never got around to teaching it because I think tax law is an amazing example of the value system of an American society. There is no way to understand the tax code except through the values that it represents. Once you start saying, why do businessmen get to deduct all of their lunches and why do you do not get to deduct your child care, you begin to say, what do we value? Okay, and so wealth and income, the tax code, predatory lending, payday lending, subprime mortgages, all these things that went fairly unregulated and disproportionately impacting Black communities is because of the values. So I want to say that anti-discrimination law is inadequate. And I'm just going to briefly say that the Patient Protection Act, notwithstanding my friend Sydney's glowing overrepresentation of what it will do, the Section 1157 is little different from Title VI on its face. I think there are plenty of people who are hoping that when it gets to court, it will be interpreted in a way that allows all the things she says. But on its face, it doesn't allow that. And I don't have the luxury of thinking that a conservative, white, mostly white court is going to suddenly say, oh, we've spent years interpreting Title VI in a way that limits race, and then now we're going to get to this new law, and even though the new law says interpret and connects it to Title VI, we're suddenly going to ignore all of the language of Title VI. So I don't think Patient Protection Act provides anything new. So when I think about distinguishing stereotypes, biases, and prejudices, we have to look at the colorblind racists who thinks they have no stereotype, biases, and prejudices, but discriminate. And that's most of the institutional racism. And I wanted to get to this in terms of saying, I taught criminal law and tort law and discrimination law. And these areas are all areas where injuries occur. There are areas of law that are intended to protect people from injuries. Why then does criminal law and tort law allow litigation from everything from intentional conduct to we don't care what your state of mind was, if you do X, you're responsible, period. But discrimination law is limited to a very narrow intentional definition. My answer is because in criminal law and tort law, the people who make the law saw themselves as potential victims. And they wanted to make sure that they and their families as victims would get into court. But in discrimination law, they saw themselves as potential victims of being unjustly accused, and so they wanted to limit the entry to court. So what do I recommend then? How much time I got?
Yeah.
What?
You have 5 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you. We need to disavow Title VI and realize that no matter how good it was, it is not effective, cannot be made effective. Just like we've had several Civil Rights Acts, it is time for a new Civil Rights Act. Title VI, bless its soul, needs to be laid to rest. And we need to have a law that recognizes multiple forms of discrimination: intentional, reckless, and negligent. We need to authorize medical testers and testers of other systems. We need to allow for individual and organizational right of action. That is one of the biggest problems into getting into court, is the fact that there has to be an individual who has identified themselves as being discriminated against and injured. Why can't we authorize civil rights organizations to go into court to be private attorney generals to enforce the law against institutions? Why do they have to seek out an individual when they got the data? Why can't they just go into court? You know, and so we need to authorize that. I'm not going to go through the rest of this because it'll be in my article. I want to we need punitive damages. Don't let anybody tell you punitive damage is unfair. The only way organizations and institutions changes their behavior is when it costs them more in court than what they can predict. And they can predict non-punitive damages. And that's how come they're quite happy to pay fines and settle, because it's all very predictable. But punitive damages, not so much. Okay, I want to kind of end with this. I put my great-grandfather was a slave, Vernellia Randall, in Texas. And his wife, Narcissus, died from lack of health care during slavery. My grandfather, born right after slavery, and my grandmother died when my dad was 11 years old from lack of health care. My family lived through Jim Crow. I lived through Jim Crow. I went to 2-room schools. I picked cotton. I used the bathroom on the side of the road because you couldn't stop at the toilets. When we traveled, we packed food because we knew there wasn't restaurants we could go to. My school didn't integrate until the year after I graduated from high school. My mother died in 1957 on a Black woman's ward in a Philadelphia hospital. My dad almost got killed by a white man who stuck a gun in his face because my dad, drunk, called his wife honey, the white woman. My uncle, I was in the car, and my uncle pleaded, "Don't kill him, they just lost their mother." And what makes me really sad is not that history, but the realization that a new system of oppression has formed for my grandkids, where people can walk up with guns and shoot them, where they can be put into jail because they're walking while Black, because there's all kind of legal oppressions that go with that felony conviction, because there are inequities that can only be called the new American apartheid. And so I'm leaving you with this. problem is that there is a new system of oppression around race. And if you work on only one part, healthcare, that would be like working on better healthcare for the slaves. That would be like working on better healthcare for people during Jim Crow. Very good idea. And yes, you're going to help some people. But if you don't dismantle the system, all you're doing is enabling it. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? I'm gathering myself. You guys can take a moment to gather yourselves, but if anybody has questions, this is the time and the opportunity to ask our panelists anything. I see you in the back. Do I need this mic?
Yes, it seems that we're at a paradox in terms of intervention. We've talked about patient relationships with physicians yesterday. We've talked about dismantling the system. And then we've talked about the issues around Title VI and intervention within that. What is actually going to take place? As Ms. Randall indicated, that it seems that we have reinvented or reimagining some form of Jim Crow. So my question is relevant to the issues around the inequities in medical. What are we operating again in a Band-Aid approach, or are these inequities inevitable? And what is? And I also find that within the arena of law, school, that there's an issue around careerism. A young public interest advocate from St. Louis yesterday indicated that when she was a young lawyer, that her ability was to want to litigate against these issues. It appears that today, when I interact or interface with law students, that it's more about other forms of career, not litigating it within the public interest sphere. Could you answer those two questions in terms of replication of a new apartheid and the tandem of the law student or within the activist community or activist law student?
I teach race and racism in American law, and one of the things that I learned from all these years of teaching is that systems of oppression happens one law at a time. And when at some point people wake up and realize that the system of oppression is there. Slavery didn't start by a law that put all black people into slavery. It started by extending the indentured servants' contracts who broke a law, and then they made laws that made children have the status of the women of their mothers, and it's just one law on top of one law on top of another law. Jim Crow was the same way. The Jim Crow was layered laws fairly quickly, and I guess what makes me feel so bad is that I was of the generation. If you look at my chart, I don't know if it's still up, but if you look at the chart, I benefited from, I went through sort of a reconstruction period after Jim Crow, and benefited from that. But from 1980 on, there has been law after law passed to put in a new system of oppression. And so yes, I'm rambling. Yes, I think we have a done deal. This you cannot think as, oh, okay, we've got time to change it. No, we have a system of oppression in place, and they're just making it worse now. And I think that the only way, short of revolution, which would be a good way, and I'm not kidding, I think that, that short of a law that really makes all forms of racial discrimination illegal, so that individual people will begin, because people don't like to be sued. And so if they have to become legally responsible for racial inequities caused by unintentional conduct, they will start putting in place systems of monitoring so that they will know. Right now, someone said, lawyers have taught people how to get around the Title VI, and how to get around it is just have some other reason for your behavior that you can articulate, and people will let you do it. If we move to a system where the discrimination itself is unacceptable, period, regardless of your other reason, then people will begin to pay attention and stop discriminating. They'll find other ways to make money.
The second question.
I'm sorry, sir. We only have time for one more question, so if I could pass, if anybody else has another one, if not, we'll come back to you. But does anyone else have another question? I see a hand here, right behind you.
Hi, I'm Michelle Van Ryn, and first I want to say this fabulous panel, really inspiring, all the talks, so thank you for that. What you just said about implicit, that if people are responsible and if institutions are responsible for the impact of implicit bias, then action will be taken. I resonate to that, I do. And when I try to talk about it, so I work within a system in a hearts and mind way, right? So, and I was talking to my colleague Kristen here about being inside a medical care system and trying to hearts and minds people into change. And I keep waiting for the negligent laws, right? Where's the negligence laws? We know it's happening. We know it's creating tremendous morbidity and mortality. And what I keep coming against is, show me the individual who can sue. So I was so excited as a healthcare person to get invited to this, because I was like, okay, because from this hearts and minds thing, it's not working out real well. Right? So sometimes what I do, and I have a question for you, I know it doesn't seem like I do, and that is, how can we first stop talking about cultural competence, training in cultural competence doesn't affect bias, that finding out that unintentionally there's a group of people discriminating against them. They don't mean to, right? If you think about it that way, don't you think there might be things put into place to monitor and correct?
No.
No?
I think the fact of the matter is, over the last 50 years, I've seen study after study after study reported in the news, and every time it's get reported, white people go, oh my God, I can't believe that's happening.
No, I'm saying if it was happening to white people, if there was unintentional bias against white people.
Yeah, but the problem is the systems are not run.
Okay.
I think that I don't think that implicit bias is the sole thing of white people. Okay, no, obviously, black people have implicit bias. 40% of black people don't like black people. Okay, but black people don't run systems. And so if you're talking about the systems in which all this is occurring, we have to talk about white people. I mean, yeah, implicit. And so the problem is I think if you could show that white people were being implicitly biased against by white people, it'd probably be resignated, but I'm not sure how you would show that when white people are benefiting from implicit bias, not being disadvantaged by it.
See, I'm talking about the will to make the change. Just reflects power structures. I'm agreeing with you on that.
Yeah, I understand. And I think the will to make the change, this is why I'm all for the law. I was a nurse for 20 years before I went into law school, and I believe in law-changing behavior, because I believe people obey stupid laws. And they obey them without thinking about it. And because we are a people who like to obey the law, we will obey laws that we disagree with. So it seems to me that the will to change will come from a law that says you can't do that. They'll be pissed, but they will implement ways to make sure that it's not happening.
And how to create that law.
That's a good point.
Can I just say that I do not see the environment in which there is going to be fundamental legal change. I don't see it coming from the federal courts. I think there are very few states that in fact have judiciary that will experiment with progressive solutions. I do not see it coming from, I think that our politics right now is so frozen because of money. I just don't see, except for local change, some at the state level and some with municipalities, I do not see that we have any possibility, either using the courts or Congress, to get any kind of laws passed that would make this possible. I mean, perhaps that will change in decades to come, but right now, I do not see that we have a political climate in which any of this is even discussable, much less able to come to a vote.
All right, and that's where we will begin. So, we will get back into our breakout sessions. I have tried to order it. I'm going to tell you the sections, and then I will give you the direction. So this is going to be 1 up there again. So you 3, and then the 3 in the back will be group 2, 3 up top, 3 right there in the second row from the top will be group 3. The middle is group 4. Group 5 is back there. Those two rows, okay? And then group 6 we'll do right here, okay? Now, the sheets are going out. You will notice on the sheet that it says to use the health disparity that you came up with yesterday, but I see some new faces. And so what we should do is to identify one health disparity. I'm going to put up my slide, and I have given you an example of health disparity. Okay, hold on, let's go through here. Okay, and breast cancer, and to begin to think about the solutions. And so, traditionally in my speeches, I talk about how Title VI does not work and how the laws are not effective. But I'm going to move beyond that, and we're going to look at the bright spot, right? Because if we get wedded to what is not going to happen, we cannot think about the possibilities of what can, right? And so taking from their discussion, right, so we don't necessarily start at the federal level. We start at the ground, as we did before in the civil rights movement and all of the grassroots movement, about making change at the local level. And so when you go to your breakout sessions and begin to talk about these solutions, think about them at the local level, whether that means in a county, in a city, in a state. But what can we do? What are the changes that we need to make to address these things? One example is stop talking about cultural competency. I hate cultural competency. I hate that language, because what it does is to say to some people, you have to become competent. It's not that you have to treat people as people and do the best thing for them. And so that could be a difference in what we need to do. So hopefully I'm inspiring you to think about solutions and ways that we can move forward on the grassroots levels that we can begin. And so that maybe not decades, but maybe 5 years from now, right, that we can begin to move, that we can begin to sit in and say, along with our doctors, if we empower them to say, we can make this movement, okay? That's my speech. Let's get together and let's begin to do some work. We will come back together at 11 o'clock. Okay, so that gives you about 25 minutes. And report on the things that we have begun to focus. We're going to have some solutions.
Don't
Okay.
forget civil disobedience is a real option.